You're back with me now. I'm so sorry about that. For those of you catching up with this video later on, my name's Amanda Edmiston. I started telling stories on this morning's Facebook live feed from the Scottish Storytelling Centre, or secretly from my living room near Stirling. but and the joys of working from home mean that when someone out in the street down at the phone box where all the wires go in and the Wi-Fi comes from, the Wi-Fi goes off and my filming stops. Alternatively, if you're catching up with me and you saw the start of our story a few minutes ago, you might be forgiven for thinking that there was a trow playing around, or maybe a brownie or two, because although I started to tell you a story about a Scottish trow, the other fairy creature in my story is, well, nowhere near as well behaved. They're prone to fiddling with wires and messing about and causing all kinds of mischief. So maybe it was trying to stop me sharing my story with you this morning. But we all seem to be here again now, and everything seems to be working. But will you do me a favour and keep a lookout for any mischievous fairy folk you see darting about, especially if they're fiddling with any wires, because I don't want to lose you mid-story again. So where was I? Oh yes, trows. A very Scottish kind of troll. Now, the trow is said, as I told you earlier, to have come over with the Vikings. And just like the trolls that you all know about, they do like lurking in dark places. Under bridges, listening out for billy goats was one theory, but the trows I know about prefer a story and a song. And does anyone remember what a trow looks like? You do? They were about the height of the average 8-year-old. But unlike 8-year-olds, they had very long beards and very big bottoms. Now, does anyone remember what word I used for a trow's very large bottom? You've got it, a bahookie. We call a bottom a bahookie in Scotland, and the trow in my story has a very big bahookie and a very long beard, but it's only about yay high. And like the trow lurking under the billy goat's bridge, this one likes dark places, but instead of hiding out near damp rivers, he prefers somewhere warm and cosy. Now, the trow in my story has not got anywhere warm and cosy to go. In fact, he's been travelling for a very long time, trying to find somewhere to warm his toes and make his fingers toasty and not numb from the cold. He wanders far and he wanders wide, through forests and up mountains, down mountains, across rivers and over hills. And as he walks, the snow begins to fall. But my story needs to take a twist and a turn and start somewhere else. In a village, a long, long time ago, not so far from here, at the mouth of a big, wide river, just before it went down to the sea, there lived a family, and they were very, very poor, and they only just got by. They had a wee bit of land, and on it they grew kale and oats and barley, and enough vegetables just to get them and their children through. To supplement their diet, to add extra things, the father, Peter, would go out once or twice a week in his wee boat and see what fish he could catch. When he had a lucky day, he would come back with a net full of silver fish. The family would put the fish in big barrels and fill them up with salty brine to keep them all the way through the long winter. And next to the barrel of fish, they kept another barrel full of oats, dried out, safe from the damp, so they could make hearty porridge when the nights drew in. There came one night when Molly, the mother of the family, and the children were waiting for the sound of their father coming back with boat. They waited and waited, but the sound of his footsteps coming up the path never came. It got dark and cold, and still no sign of their father appearing in the night. The next morning he still hadn't returned, and a huge storm drew in. It rumbled, and with the thunder came huge snow clouds, and the snow started to gently fall. Rumbling thunder and drifting snow. Thunder snow, the stuff of legends. And as the cold drew in, Molly knew her husband might not make it back that night. Well, the days went on, and the fishing boat didn't come back. There became less and less food for Molly and her children to eat. And eventually they had nothing left but a wee bit of fishy, salty water in the bottom of the barrel, and a few husks, the dry seed husks from oats, and a slightly limp kale leaf or two. Molly decided there was nothing for it. She had to go out and knock on her neighbours' doors and see if they had a crust of bread or a bowl of barley they could spare her to feed herself and her children. She took her eldest son, and the pair walked round the houses in the village nearby. But nobody else had very much and had very little to share with them. They shook their heads sadly and apologised, saying they would help her if they could, but they had no food to give. Even the shop had barely anything left in its cupboards, and couldn't even give her something and let her pay in a week or two's time. Molly and her son made their way up and down the village, asking anyone they could, but had absolutely nothing. There was one house left. High up on the hill at the very top of the village, there was a dark, shady house that the children always whispered was haunted. But Molly and her son bravely marched up the winding street to the house and knocked on the huge oak door. It was opened by a tiny old woman, her face lined with wrinkles that told of anger and misery. But behind her, there was piled up to the ceiling huge truckles of cheese. There were hams and sides of bacon hanging from the rafters. There were big stacks of apples and fresh fruit and vegetables, the like of which Molly's son had never seen before. "Mummy!" gasped. "Surely she'll be able to help us." But when Molly asked if the woman could spare them some food, the woman said no and slammed the door. A tear rolled down Molly's son's face. "Mummy said, why would she be so mean?" And Molly shook her head sadly. I don't know, son, but I do know one thing. We're better than that. We may not have any food to eat, but if anyone ever knocked on my door, then I would share what I had. I would never turn anyone away to starve. Proudly, Molly and her son marched back down the street to their house, and there they made up a bowl of fishy, salty water with the dry husks of oats and chopped up wilted kale leaf. Try some? No? Oh. But what they did have, they might not have had much food, but what they did have was plenty of soft peat gathered from up on the moor to keep the fire going and keep everyone cosy and warm. And Molly picked up a peat and put it on the fire. They may go hungry, but they would be warm and cosy. And she started to tell her children a story to make them forget about the ache in their belly and the lack of food. Well, the night drew in. The snow whirled and howled around the house, falling in deep, soft, white drifts. And as Molly span a story for her children in front of the cosy fire, she heard a gentle tap at the door. When she opened it, she saw a little man, about the height of the average 8-year-old. I know how tall our troll was. It was a little bit the same height as a boy I once met in Yorkshire. His name was Monty. If any of you know a boy called Monty in Yorkshire who's about yay high and maybe about 8 or so, imagine a little man about that height. But imagine, if you will, that instead of the average 8-year-old, our little man has a very big beard and a very large bahookie. For those of you just catching up, a bahooki's a bottom. A little man about the height of the average 8-year-old with a huge beard and a very large bottom stood at the door, and he looked at Molly and he said, I'm cold and I'm freezing and I've travelled far. I've travelled up mountains and down mountains, over rivers and through forests, up hills and down hills, and I'm so cold and hungry. And Molly said, well, I don't have much to give, but what I've got you can share. Come on in. And she gave the wee man a comfy seat by the fire, and she put another peat on top, made it blaze cosy and warm, and then she gave him her very last bowl of fishy porridge. The old man sat there, listening to Molly as she wove a story, and he heard the children sing. He sat there drifting gently off to sleep, his toes thawing and his fingers warming. In the morning, when Molly got up, he looked at her, clear in the eye, and he said, you didn't have much to give, but what you had you shared with me. And for that, I will be forever grateful. Oh, Molly smiled and nodded and watched as the little man made his way back out into the snow and vanished into the woods. That night, Molly and the children had even less to eat than the night before, but they had plenty of peat to put on the fire. Molly took one of the soft brown lumps and broke it in two. And as she did, out fell a single gold coin. She gasped. She couldn't believe her eyes. But she knew one thing. This was no ordinary gold coin. This was a gift from her trow. She gave the coin to her son and sent him down to the shop, and he came back with barley bread and a pot of soup, and the children had a delicious meal. When Molly went to pick up another peat, another gold coin fell out. And the next day, when she built up the fire, there was another and another. Molly made sure that everyone else in her village got a share of her newfound wealth, her gift from her trow in troublesome times. And you'd think that everyone would be pleased for her, and she would have lived happily ever after, but no. Someone wasn't pleased. Someone wasn't happy. High up at the top of the hill, the old woman watched and saw. She saw Molly's new-found wealth, and she thought, why has she got so much when she came begging to my door? And late one night she crept down and peered through the window, and she watched Molly open up a peat and get a gold coin from within. Later still, before dawn broke, she made her way down the hill to Molly's peat shed, and there she loaded up a barrow with all the peat in the shed and took it back to her own house. There, she thought, all that wealth will now be mine, and she broke one of the peats open, hoping for a gold coin, but she didn't hear the of money. No, out of the peat came a rat with hungry teeth and a nibbling mouth. The woman cried, thinking that this one must be a mistake, and she picked up another peat and broke it in two, and in this one was a mouse even hungrier than the rat. Inside the next there were more and more and more rats and mice, and they scampered up the walls, eating the cheese and the ham, the bacon and the fruit and vegetables, running up her curtains, scampering round her house, nibbling hungry rats and mice. They ate and they ate until the woman had no food left, and when they'd eaten all her food, they started to nibble her furniture. They ate her curtains and her tables and her chairs until she had nothing left at all. And then she made her way into the village, tapping at doors to see if anyone would spare her a bowl of soup or a crust of bread. But everyone turned her away. There was only one house left to try. Eventually, the mean old woman from the house at the top of the hill found her way to Molly's house. Now, you would imagine she might not knock at Molly's door, but she had nothing left to try, and she knocked softly at Molly's door, and the woman opened it up. Her son said, "Oh, Mama, it's that dreadful old woman. She's asking for food. Oh, Mum, turn her away." But Molly put her hand up and said, "No. I told you then, and I'll tell you now, we're better than that. I will never turn anyone away from my door. In you come." And she made the old woman comfy by the side of the fire, and she gave her a bowl of soup and a hunk of bread. And from that day on, well, the old woman never went hungry again. And Molly, or so I'm told, carried on finding gold coins in peat whenever she went to put one on the fire. Now, that's nearly the end of my tale, but I know one or two of you would like to know, did Molly's husband Peter ever come back? Well, when the thunder snow had ended and the storm clouds drifted apart and March came in on a bird song, The fishing boat made its way back up the mouth of the river, and Peter came home. He'd been cast adrift on an island, but finally found his way safely back to his family. And it being a story, everyone lived happily ever after. As for the trow, it was never seen again. Well, thank you all for joining me. And I was hoping we'd have a little bit. I'm looking at a clock up there. I should all be looking at you. I hope you all enjoyed the story. I was going to tell you another story, and we are running low on time. But I will quickly tell you a very, very short story. Now, this one is all about a slightly different sort of Scottish fairy. But it doesn't start with a fairy. It starts with a very smart girl. She was called Feemy, and she and her father had just come into a new town. They'd bought themselves an old inn, and Feemy's father had great ideas about how he'd transform it and make it all shiny and new and attract new people and travellers as they made their way along the dusty roads and travelled up to the Highlands. He decided he'd start by cutting down the gnarled old rowan tree that bent and curved its way over the door. Its roots now lifted up the path, and he worried that visitors to his inn would trip over and fall and hurt themselves, maybe bang themselves on one of the low branches as they came in the door. Now all the local folk whispered and muttered and said no good will come of it. But he paid them no attention, and he got on with the task in hand, routing out roots and planting a neat flower bed where the tree had once stood. Shortly after, he had his first guest, and he made everything right for them. He fed them a delicious meal. The beds were cosy and soft with fresh sheets. There were fires in the fireplace, and he brought everyone a warm mug of milk, all flavoured with cinnamon, and all set to soothe you off to sleep. But when they got up in the morning, they complained that they'd had no sleep at all through the night. They'd had sensation they were being pinched and tickled and pestered and kept awake, and they'd had a dreadful night. They wouldn't be staying here again, and guest after guest in the first few weeks shook their head and vowed to never return. Well, the days rolled by, and eventually Feemy said to her father, "Father, we're going to have to try and find a way around this. Why don't we send out a message that whoever can find out what's going bump in the night and scaring our guests away can have a reward?" Her father thought about this long and hard. She was a clever girl, and he decided she was right. They put word out near and far that whoever found out what was scaring their guests away could have a handsome reward, a bag of gold, dinner every Saturday night for the rest of their life. Well, lots of people came by, but no sooner had they gone to bed with their warm cinnamon and nutmeg milk than they fell fast asleep in the soft beds, and then they too were awoken by pinching and punching and biting and tickling. "Oh," they said, "we don't know what it is, but it's horrible. We're not coming back." Eventually, Feemy got chatting to one of her friends, a young man who, well, he'd been brought up by the local wise woman, and he knew a thing or two about the fairy folk, those hidden people that lived in the hills nearby. He said he thought he could find the answer to Feemy and her father's problems, and he came over one evening to spend the night in their inn. Instead of the warm, milky drink, he decided to have a tea with fresh mint leaves. You know, that lovely minty smell, like mint chocolate chip ice cream, but in a leaf. Yummy. He put mint into tea and he sat, not on the bed, not cosy under the duvet, but in a hard chair, sipping mint tea and watching and waiting. As he sat there, he heard a clatter on the roof tiles, like hundreds of tiny feet dancing about above his head. The next thing he knew, he heard a... and something flew down the chimney and clattered into the fireplace. There stood a little tiny, hairy Bruni. "Oh," said the Bruni, "what are you doing and what are you awake for?" "Well," said the young man, "I've come to find out what you're doing here." "Oh," said the Bruni, "I'll see about that." But the young man knew a story or two, and he started to tell all kinds of tales, and the Bruni sat and listened. After a while, the young man said to him, "So you tell me a story about yourself." And the Bruni started to chatter and laugh with his new friend about the mischief him and his companions were causing for the innkeeper and Feemy. He said, "Oh, you'll never know the fun we have poking and pinching and keeping travellers awake." And the young man said, "Oh, well, you're a fine fellow, but I'm a-going to my bed now, so let's end as friends. What's your name?" And the Bruni said, "Oh, well, I'm not telling you that. You tell me your name first." And the young man said, "Oh, you'll never believe me. I've got a funny name. I'm the youngest of 7 brothers. And my mother, although she's a wise woman, had run out of ideas by the time she named me. And so all my brothers and my mum just call me myself. Where's myself? Where's the wee one?" It was my first word, you see, myself, and they've just called me it forever after. "Myself?" said the Bruni. "You're called myself?" "Yes," said the young man. "See, I told you you wouldn't believe me." "Oh," said the Bruni, "I've never heard the like of it." And he got up and he gave the young man a sharp prod in the knee, and he started to tickle him, his little mischievous face lighting up with naughtiness. But the young man was a match for a Bruni. And he got up and he started to tickle the wee fellow, and he started to pinch and pester and pull his hair, and the Bruni started to scream and shout. Down came a voice from the chimney. "Who's bothering you? Who's bothering you?" And the Bruni shouted up, "It's myself! Myself! Myself is pinching me." You guessed, didn't you? The Brunies up on the roof clattered and laughed. They had never heard anything so silly. "You're pinching and pestering yourself. Oh, you're nothing but a silly." And they laughed so hard that they clattered and tripped and fell right off the roof. Whereupon Feemy, down in the courtyard, got a hard broom and swept them all psht, 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 right out of the gate, and they ran away laughing. The last little Bruni shot up the chimney as soon as the young man let him go. And, well, I would like to say that the Brunies were never seen again, but they were. They came back and they tried to pester other guests, but the young man knew his stuff. He talked to his mother, and the next week or so he and his brothers came round and they dug a hole by the inn's front door and they planted a brand new rowan tree. And once the tree rooted in and started to grow, well, the inn was protected from mischievous fairies forever after. And Feemy, being the wise girl that she was, remembered and planted sweet scented mint and thyme and other delicious herbs in the garden rather than the boring begonias her father had planted. And she also remembered from that day on, when she made warm milk for travellers who came to stay, who from that day on had the most lovely sleep in their cosy beds. But she also made an extra little saucer of milk and left it outside the inn garden fence for the brownies, just to keep them on the sweet side. Thank you all very, very much for putting up with the trow trouble or the brownie bother at the very start of the first attempt to share a story with you today. And thank you all for staying a little bit after the end of break time, after the end of Tuck Shop Tales. If you've got any questions or anything, do send them over to me and I will quickly try and answer them. You can find me on my Facebook page, Amanda Edmiston, Botanica Fabula, Herbal Storyteller. And I hope to see you all at the Scottish Storytelling Centre again soon. Hope you're all keeping well. Thank you all very much and goodbye. Here's the off button.